All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming to this year's Lectures Literature panel. The goal for this is for us to discuss the best resources on what the subject for lectures is, and we hope to make this an annual event. And so we have here Dr. McClister, Jeff Wilson, also a doctor, and Dr. Dilbeck and Philip Martin here joining us to discuss the resources on Philippians and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And so we have a slight schedule we'll follow here and a presentation hopefully in the middle of this we'll get to in just a moment. So let's get it kicked off with you guys telling me what is your connection with the college. Just tell me how you would describe your connection. Any one of you can start here. I don't know, McClister, if you want to get, since you're closest to the microphone.
I've been teaching in the Department of Biblical Studies here since 1996, so they're kind of stuck with me at this point.
I'm actually a Tampa native, born and raised, grew up just down the street, was a student here from 93 to 97.
I'm currently teaching in the Biblical Studies department. This is my 6th year, I believe, and I didn't attend here ever.
How he got in, we don't know.
I'm an alumnus from 96. I was here when Jeff was here. That's probably why I'm on the panel, to keep him in check. But my kids go here, and I read books.
Thank you for that. All right, so we'll get started here. Which of these books do you feel like is harder to study either individually or teach others, Philippians or 1st and 2nd Thessalonians? Anybody want to tackle which one do you think is harder?
Probably 2nd Thessalonians, just because of the ever ubiquitous problem of the man of lawlessness or sin and what you want to do with that.
Okay.
So that's just always leaves more questions than answers.
Okay. Well, you also added, Jeff, about recovering the apocalyptic outlook about 2nd Thessalonians. You want to elaborate on that for us?
Yeah. Though I just, one of the challenges when, with the historical critical method where a lot of commentaries sit, and we like to dig deep into everything from the language to the culture to the rhetoric, especially in New Testament studies. And, apocalyptic's kind of been a neglected angle. And when I say apocalyptic, I'm not necessarily talking about the hardcore, precisely defined, genre and, with keys and, fits into a certain point in the literary development of the Bible. I'm thinking more just the idea of the seen and the unseen being brought together, and that the seen and unseen influence each other. And so especially with Thessalonians, where you have this strong connection between, the second coming of Jesus and adjusting their hopes and expectations, but still living in light of it, being sober and so forth. 2nd Thessalonians, especially with whatever's going on with the man of lawlessness, there's a sense there in which, whatever's happening on earth is influenced by the unseen acts of God. And then the same thing with Philippians, especially Paul's emphasis on the resurrection there, right? That, the bringing the seen and the unseen together in the end, in the eschaton.
Okay. Anybody else want to add to what he said on that one? Bill, you had something interesting I noticed, is it said you feel like 1st Thessalonians is deceptively challenging. And so I wanted to see if you could elaborate a little bit about why you chose to emphasize that, since most would do instead the man of lawlessness.
Well, to be clear, I'm not saying it's more difficult than 2nd Thessalonians because of the man of lawlessness, but I think that when you compare 1st Thessalonians to 2nd Thessalonians, it doesn't have a particular section that is that difficult in comparison. And also, it doesn't have the doctrinal difficulties that you have to deal with in Galatians and Romans. It doesn't have all the different, I guess you could say, congregational issues of 1 Corinthians. But, it's still difficult. For example, in first chapter, it's a very warm tone. But then you go to chapter 2, and sounds like he's defending himself. Why is that? And people can't even agree whether he's defending himself. Scholars disagree about of course, the relationship between it and 2nd Thessalonians, which is really sort of a different issue. But scholars can't even agree to whether we should approach 1 Thessalonians from a rhetorical point of view or not. So I think these issues are easy to overlook. But, there's a selection of essays written primarily about 1 Thessalonians 2, and it's just about that chapter, and that chapter really tells you tries to answer the question, what is Paul doing in 1 Thessalonians? I don't even think we can answer that question very clearly.
Well, I hate to put you on the spot, but do you recall what that book is that does the collection of essays, the title or editor? Do you may know that
No,
one?
I
That's
can't.
all right. Sorry
I
to
can't.
put you on the spot like
Yeah,
that. Okay.
thank you. Appreciate that.
Sorry.
Isn't it called the Thessalonians Debate?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you. Thank you. I don't remember the editor, but yeah, thank you. Is it? Okay, good. Thank you.
All right, there you go. So there's your first book. That one's not on your list, which, by the way, I'll use this opportunity to tell you, we do have a select bibliography of what all was cited in this year's lecture book. So you have that over here. You can pick that up at the end of today's panel. It's not everything, but a select bibliography of what got cited. And on that note, Philippians, the most cited book was Gordon Fee on Philippians. And we do have this available in the bookstore, actually. You can buy this in the bookstore for the same price that it currently is on Amazon. So you don't have Fee on Philippians and you want to add that to your library, you don't have to pay an Amazon to deliver it. You can just go right down to our bookstore after this and pick that up. And all of you all mentioned a different one. Some of y'all did mention Fee. We'll come back to that. But all four of you mentioned as one of the best books for Philippians is Moises Silva and the BECNT. And so we do have that also in the bookstore. It will have this kind of cover. But this is the cover that it says down there. This is an older edition that we have here, and so you can definitely pick that one up as well. But you want to tell me, why is that one of the best ones on Philippians?
So is just a really careful scholar. I've heard him speak a couple times, and he's just very methodical with the text. He doesn't make a whole lot of assumptions. He just simply lets the text say what it says, and anytime somebody's doing that, I think you should get your fill of that.
His book was surprisingly thin. If you like thin books, it's a thin book.
Right, and I think part of it too is, and I think we'll get to this in due course later when we talk about use of original languages, but Silva literally has written a couple of books on the right use of original languages, and he models that in his work in terms of his exegesis and how he rightly and carefully handles the original languages. Not to mention, because he's a seminary professor, he really straddles the line between, kind of cutting edge scholarship, but with an understanding that at the end of the day, many people are going, it's really about also reaching people in the pews. And so he's really got an ear well attuned to both worlds, in my opinion.
At least for me, the value to it was, like Jeff was pointing out, it's level. So books are often written to try to accomplish a couple different things, but they require you to know more before you can understand clearly what they're getting at. And a couple of the most common cited sources are at that easily accessible level for individuals who may not have great language skills or may not have great scope of understanding of the larger world of the New Testament. And so by having that, not so much an intro, because it's definitely deeper than that, but that first step up really makes a good entry into that kind of reading. And then if you read a few more books like that, then you can read one a little bit deeper. And then you read 3 more books like that first level. Now you can read 2 books that are a little bit deeper. And eventually you can build enough of a personal understanding that you don't have to have 2 other dictionaries next to you to understand what the guy's talking about. And so someone like Silva, someone like Fee does that. The most accessible, and he's cited a couple times, like would be N.T. Wright. The difference between Wright and Silva is bias, and the obviousness of the bias and how rooted it is in the exegesis of the text or their applications. Because that's why Silva, for me, ended up being at the top of the list, was that accessibility side. Will, did you have something else?
So since Fee was cited a lot, anybody want to have weigh in on Fee and what makes him? Is it the same thing or anything unique about Fee to be aware of?
He is a Pentecostal, so that will come across in his writings. He believes in, I'm not confusing him with somebody else, am I? So passages that talk about the Spirit, he will take a different take on those for sure.
All right. Will, you said, and I hope I pronounced this right, Rumens in the Anchor series has a good treatment on Philippians too. Can you elaborate what that's about?
Well, he's talking about this difficult passage for the hymn about Jesus, and I mean the issues in that passage are numerous, as many of you probably know, from lexical issues to conceptual issues to the form critical question of, well, is this a pre-existent hymn that Paul used, or did Paul compose it, or something of that nature. And I just think he does a pretty even-handed approach, even though it's a tremendously difficult and long-standing debate. But I also think there's some interesting views that he takes. For example, he translates the word morphe, which is vital to how we understand that passage. He does so by saying in the sphere of God, which actually eliminates some of the problems. But of course, that's problematic, and he acknowledges that. So I just think it's very thorough, but also it's relatively accessible. So.
All right, and McClister, you noted that Hawthorne and the Word Biblical Commentary follows Martin on Philippians 2, but you recommend it as a good source. So did you want to join in with any on Philippians 2 and elaborating on Hawthorne and how he handles it?
Yeah, I like Hawthorne's treatment. Hawthorne's book is in a second edition now. The second edition was updated and revised by Ralph Martin. So Martin kind of layered some of his ideas about the prehistory of Philippians 2 into that text. I'm having trouble remembering exactly what Martin's thesis. Jeff, maybe you can help me, but he does something a little weird with what he thinks the purpose of that hymn was. I'm not remembering it off the top of my head.
I always avoided Martin because I thought he was weird. but it seems like the two big things. I went back and looked to scribble down. The two big things was, doesn't Martin only think that the hymn deals with Jesus' earthly life, so he's kind of sticking with the pre-existence issue, and then he wants to make it solely an ethical model as opposed to.
That's what it was. Yeah, that the ethical model is the thing that stood out to me. So he really doesn't treat it as we would treat that text, and I think that's a drawback of that second edition, that it's got that kind of layered into it there.
Yeah, Carbon Christie. Yeah, he's never let go of his dissertation, Phil. Since we've talked.
All right, one last thing on Philippians. We'll keep this a little bit brief and we'll elaborate more later. McClister, you recommended the academic articles on Roman honor by Hellerman, and so we will show people how to get access to that later on in that part of the presentation. But did you want to say anything more before we move on to 1st and 2nd Thessalonians?
Oh yeah, I always recommend those articles to anybody. They're in the journal Bibliotheca Sacra several years ago now, I think the early 2000s. But they put that text into its Roman context of honor and, climbing the social ladder. It does a really good job of showing how Paul is kind of inverting the Roman model of honor, and the Romans had a term. What is the term for it? The cursus honorum, the cursus honorum, how Paul is kind of turning that upside down. And if you think about how Philippi was a Roman colony, how that would have resonated with those folks, I think that those are just really good articles to know about when you're reading Philippians.
Okay, so don't let me forget. I'm going to show you how to get access to those thanks to a Florida College program that we're going to talk about later. All right, let's go into 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Jeff and Philip, you mentioned Beale in the IVP New Testament. What makes him unique on those in that series?
One of the biggest things about Beale in general is that he does a great job looking at Old Testament and even to a lesser extent Jewish, kind of Second Temple literature, but especially Old Testament themes. And that's the thing. It's probably one of the biggest things in scholarly circles in recent years, as the kind of rhetorical approaches and cultural approaches have cultural approaches have gone on, is recognizing that there's just as much debt to Old Testament literature. And not just quotations, right? It's themes and concepts, not even allusions, themes and concepts. And Beale does a good job, for instance, without getting into what I agree with or disagree with, like reading the man of lawlessness against Daniel chapter 11, that, instead of we're looking all over the place, really focusing on, again, Old Testament possibilities first before we go outside. Because Beale recognizes that the New Testament really is a continuation of Old Testament theology in a lot of ways. That's another discussion for another day, I guess.
Is this intentional, Jeff? Are you wanting me to say things?
Absolutely.
No. Much in the same way, I just think it's really important, and I think David and I were talking about this yesterday, that we make sure that we're careful to think about how individual who came out of that culture of Israel, who's in the Second Temple context of time frame, would have thought of the teaching of Jesus, would have thought of the parables, but then how they would have applied them. And especially in the apocalyptic sense, like what's going to happen next? What is going to be resolved? What are we looking for? It's a challenge for a 21st century believer to live in a world that is so materialized. We have all this, everything is about the stuff. And much of the writing of the apocalyptic side is the shedding of all those things and trying to see a larger system of order. And I think Beale, at least when he was pulling in some of the ideas that I was reading along through his work, seemed to touch on that regularly to say, hey, this is really important. It's not in the same way in which some of the more popular authors that are well known right now are talking about the same subjects of the seen realm and the unseen realm. And I thought that was at least useful to me. It was beneficial on my side. So it made it worth saying this is really good to read.
Okay. Well, Dr. Dilbeck and McClister, you guys, again, pointed towards the Anchor series. So here's what I want you to do, Bill. If you can just briefly tell us a little bit more about the Anchor series. I don't feel like I hear that one come up as much as it did this time. And then specifically, then it's Malherbe in the Anchor series on 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, why you like him specifically.
Well, I think the Anchor Bible series is like other series. It's uneven. Some of them are better than others. But largely, I think a lot of the newer editions, because now they're replacing older commentaries, and some of them, that's a very good thing. But some of the newer ones are I think, well, the most valuable part is a lot of them are newer than the other commentaries written on particular books. And so with Malherbe's actually a little bit dated now, I guess, in comparison to other volumes. But I like Malherbe's approach because I think a decent litmus test for whether a commentary is good or not is to see how they deal with difficult passages. Ideally, you'd want to read through the whole thing and form a basis that way, but I don't really have the time or inclination to do that in many cases. So I think a good litmus test otherwise then is see how they deal with difficult passages. And Malherbe, 2 Thessalonians 2 again, I think he deals with that in a very even-handed approach. He's cautious, but I also like the fact that he brings up Greco-Roman sources, and so this we've already talked about this sort of indirectly, but which part of Paul's cultural milieu shines the brightest? Is it his Jewishness, or is it his Greco-Roman background? And part of the problem is we don't know the level of his education. I wish we knew that, but we don't. So these are sort of open questions, but I think Malherbe really helps, at least for me. It really helps me in that regard. So.
All right, thank you. Dr. McClister, you want to add anything to that about Malherbe and the Anchor series?
No, just I would just add that Malherbe spent his scholarly career investigating the kind of the sociological backgrounds of New Testament communities and churches, and so anytime you can get some kind of perspective on that, it's very well done. And he tended to be among the people that he was peers with, he was probably more conservative than most of them. Now the Anchor Bible is now called, I think, the Yale Anchor Bible. So Yale University took it over, and like Will said, it's very uneven. There are some volumes that most scholars would say don't even waste your time with, but it's written from a liberal critical perspective, so you have to be very careful in handling what you read. But there's good stuff there if you dig for it.
All right, Jeff, you had an answer along the lines of not interacting with commentaries as much as you do journal articles. And so I wanted you to tell me what you thought about journal articles. And you saw some new ones in this year's lecture book, it looked like, that you were excited about.
Yeah, I mean, just, in general, after a long time reader, you kind of, you know what the commentaries are going to be in the bibliography, by and large. So usually I'm more interested in journal articles maybe I haven't heard of or picked up on before. And of course, because journal articles, a lot of journals are either published two to four times a year, depending on the journal. Whereas new commentaries only come along every so often. Usually there's a lot more churn in the journal articles, right? There's a lot more opportunity for new stuff to come in that you missed or didn't notice. And so, yeah, I'm always on the lookout for journal articles. So, yeah, when we were emailing back and forth, I threw 3 in there that I actually printed them out. I was going to read them. I left them on my desk at home, forgot them, so I had to read something else on the plane down. But yeah, no, that's what I look for.
All right, let me ask any of y'all can tackle this one. It is the journal articles that we're going to show access to here. That'll be the next segment here. Do you feel like at times they're too advanced for preachers, elders, or Bible class teachers? How would you set up what we're about to show them on how to get access to this? Because some people it'll be maybe their first time to ever dive into this. For others, they may be old hats or they did it 2 decades ago. What can you say about journal articles?
Just because I'm holding the mic, it depends on the journal. In other words, ATLA, is a huge database with lots of options. And so I think the trick is to learn what, and maybe this is a service we could provide, which is kind of ranking journals by, some journals specialize in it's technical for academics and scholars. Some journals are intentionally geared towards, more in the church concerns, kind of seminary professors writing or meant for highly educated clergy in the denominations. But the end goal is this is for the church, broadly conceived. So it really depends on the journal, to be honest.
I think that last part was real important. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Generally speaking, if you're not familiar with the professional journals, the academic journals, you're not going to go to a journal and get an idea of what a verse in the Bible means. Usually they are much more focused than that. A phrase, a concept, a background issue, some kind of grammatical point, something like that. It'll be a very deep dive, 20 pages, more than you'd ever want to read on, something. It's where scholars talk about the nitty-gritty detail stuff, and a lot of that never makes it into commentaries, only by way of mention of a general point. So if you like getting into the weeds and really digging with details, the journals are the place to go.
Either of you guys have something to add? Or are we ready for the? Sorry. Okay.
I would just add something really quickly. Like the Anchor Bible series, though, it's very uneven, and I think that may be perhaps the most difficult part for preachers and teachers and elders to sift through, because there's anyone who's been to the Society of Biblical Literature meeting recently, you understand the varying methodologies that are out there for approaching the biblical text. And so that can make reading these journals, I think, maybe even more difficult. If you don't understand the methodological assumption that they're probably not going to state in a scholarly journal at the very beginning, I think that could be very confusing. So.
Journals are where you're listening into the conversation with scholars.
Yeah. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, one thing you can frame it a different way. All these articles are super interesting to 1% of the potential readership, maybe. And then the rest of it is like, what is this? I have no value to. Yeah, like us, and even then we'll probably argue which ones have value. But there are some journals that are written for a wider audience, some of the history-based journals, some theological journals that are really actually designed to work at a lower level. But that doesn't mean they're good. It just means that they're designed to work at that lower level. So once you kind of figure that out, you say, okay, well, this might have a couple good things of value. My approach has actually been backwards with this, in that before I started doing some different things, I would actually just go through the bibliographies of various commentaries I was reading, and when they would cite a journal article, I would go find the journal article if I was interested. And so that was my primary use of it, was to say, hey, they said this is why they thought this. Why do they think this? Then I would go read it. I was, guess, in the reverse order of going to the journal first. When I did that, there was a lot of value. But it's only limited. It's limited to that one time, that one thing. And half of the time, what was said in the journal article was a whole lot of other things that were irrelevant to the actual reason the guy cited it in that particular piece. And so I don't know if it's too difficult or for the average use, but I do think there are better things that can be done to really help preachers and teachers do better than they're already doing in that same space. And some of this is part of here, but I don't know about difficulty, because that's really hard to question. If you don't know the language, that would be like a big challenge. If you didn't know any original language, or if you're not great with English itself, that probably.
Well, I think this was your idea that we show people they could get access to this, and now you just trashed it right as I go to pivot to it. So thanks a lot for that, Philip.
But it's about how. there's some great value to it.
Well,
Good stuff there.
Yeah. Well, here's one way you can do your how. We'll do this. We'll try to save it now. Okay.
Pull it out of the file.
So there were a few journal articles cited in this year's lecture book. A lot were by Shane Scott in his essay, which I guess he still hasn't. That's probably, I think, tomorrow. And as what you'll see here is all of them but one are accessible on Atla. And what we want to show you real quickly is that the Florida College Alumni and Friends Club, the Hutchinson Bell, has made it possible for you to have access to print these off, full text articles on. So if there is one that interests you, like Philip was saying, for example, the one that I've already heard some people talk about is Stone, Campbell, and the Man of Sin, to get back to some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, in the Restoration Quarterly Journal. If you join the Hutchinson Bell, you will be able to have access to go read that article that Shane makes references to. So I'm going to show you real quick how you'll do that. When you go to the main website here of the Hutchinson Bell, you'll see there you can click on membership and click on the benefits, and this will take you then to the page where it lists all the different benefits for being a member of the Hutchinson Bell. And one of those benefits is access to the American Theological Library Association's database of journal articles. That's what we're all here talking about. And so you'll click on that link there, which would then take you to a screen where you're going to put in the username and password. And the way to get that is to join the Hutchinson Bell. And once you've joined the Hutchinson Bell, they'll send you an email with all that in it. Each year it updates. We have to change those. And so you email Ms. Bitsit, who's here with us today. And so she said she'd stick around till things are over if you want to talk to her about joining the Hutchinson Bell. And so once you have a login, it brings you to a fairly easy to use and understand screen such as this, where you can type in any kind of search. In the top left corner, you see that you can do a specific search to publication, scriptures, or index. And so I'm going to explain that very briefly in case you do decide to join, or even if you've already joined but you've not been making use of this. If you knew you were looking for the article on Restoration Quarterly, you can click on publication, you type in Restoration Quarterly, and then it's going to take you to a screen where it lists all the available years and volumes of Restoration Quarterly to then narrow it down to where you need to go for your article. And you type in just a basic author search. Sometimes if you're searching Marty Pickup and you have his name correct, and of course then it brings up again full PDF of the full text of his articles. But if you were to misspell the name, like if you didn't know how to type in McClister, that is what you'll do with index. I know you laugh, but I typed in his name and it said we don't have anything by him, and I knew they did, so that's why I thought I'd use you to illustrate this. You click on index, and you can then say you want to search by author McClister, and they'll tell you the proper way to put his name in on the Atla database. So if you're looking for an author and it doesn't come up, perhaps the index can help you out with that. You'll see here his articles that are in here. Again, when you click on the PDF, then you will get to have, and you see on the far right, you can email it, you can print it, you can cite it and save it, all kinds of different things you can do with it. When you click on that PDF full text, it does bring up your ability to just print that right off and start reading. If you're old-fashioned like me, if you're younger and you like an e-reader, you don't even have to print it off. You just save some paper and ink to read the article there, that particular one that he wrote. Last of all here, I think this is the last screen we're going to have two more screens. So scripture search, this is the most basic one, pretty straightforward. You go to the book that you want, click on the chapter you want, and from the chapter alone, you can list articles. That might be a little bit lengthy. You may want to just search by a specific verse. And so if we're looking for the Man of Sin, you put in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 9, and it gives you a list here, it looks like, of 15 articles that you can, again, read them, print them off, whichever one sounds interesting to you. The Hellerman articles we promised earlier, all of those are available in this system. So if you want to go read those essays that Dr. McClister referenced, they're all available there, along with some other articles by Hellerman as well. So again, to get to all this, go to the Hutchinson Bell website, and you can click on that link there, Atlas Serials, to find your way to go and do all that search. You may be wondering what this will cost you. I know it sounds like a terrible sales pitch, but I wanted to make sure you knew that. And so there's individual membership and there's a family membership. And so again, you can see Ms. Bitsit when this presentation is over if you want to start making use of these journal articles. So anything else from you guys on that before we move on to our final general questions? All right, so what other digital resources for free or for purchase do you all recommend?
I use Logos Bible study software quite a bit. I mean, every day I use it extensively. Once you get used to using it, it's it's the best thing since sliced bread. I have several thousand volumes in my Logos library, and I can search my entire library for a phrase, for a word. I can search just the book titles. I can search the chapter headings. I can search for a word or a phrase in a certain author's books. The research and information finding abilities are just amazing. And of course, it has a full complement of biblical texts, all the English translations you'd want, Greek and Hebrew. The English translations are usually directly linked, so you just double click on a word, it brings up a lexicon with the definition. I mean, it's really worth looking at if you haven't ever seen it.
Anybody else?
I'm waiting for Jeff to go tell him he's wrong.
Logos is also very impressive, but the problem is for me to afford it, I'd have to sell one of my children. So because the basic, maybe I should, but the basic package for Logos is, in my opinion, very unhelpful. So, but you can buy the volumes you want, so you can build on that. But just the basic package, I just don't find very, very helpful. So, and I'm really cheap. So,
And I was going to say too, there's another software system, Accordance, out there. That's the one that I use because I'm not for a variety of reasons. I like my books in paper form, even though if I ever have a fire or a flood in Houston, I'm in trouble. But the trick with Accordance is I don't think it's as user friendly as Logos. But and I'm a relatively new Accordance user. The software I used to use that Phil Roberts got me into years ago, Graham Cord, kind of quit being supported and it died. So I'm still learning the ins and outs of Accordance, but I like it so far.
Yeah, a couple of things that are useful about Logos that you may not already have known or would be helpful for Bible students is, number one, if you have Logos, you can take your entire print library and add it to your Logos library, and then you can search inside of it. It will then produce for you the page, citation, location, and even the image of where that quote is. So you're not limited to just the resources you own in Logos. If they make it available some format in Logos or Faith Life, you can search for it inside of Logos. And so that's bonus number one that brings the cost down. That drops the purchase. Like, you don't have to buy a second copy. And so that's a huge benefit. Second benefit is, I think for the next edition, they're going to be including Atla results as an internal use for Logos, which I think other programs have done in the past. I can't remember a couple of them. I know that it's a normal thing. And that will help aggregate the results because you'll be able to kind of connect these details. Oh, this guy's listed in 4 of these other commentaries that I already enjoyed. Now I can have that. When it comes to the cost, just like anything else, never pay full price. And this is the last thing I'll say about it. It does not matter how cheap or how expensive a resource is that sits on your shelf. And that's the problem with purchasing whole series, like uneven series of commentaries. People do it all the time. Oh, it looks great on the shelf. It's beautiful. But if you never use it, it's wasted money. Using Logos, Accordance, BibleWorks used to be great for this, but now BibleWorks is dead too. You're actually using it, and you're more likely to use that in your development of ideas and sermons and classes, and for that side of it. And like David, I use it constantly all day long. I don't think I've shut my computer off or Logos off in like months. It just exists in the background of my day. And so I think from that standpoint, as a value tool that will help you produce better work, even if you may not have the strongest basic language skills in original languages or even academic languages that would be like German, French, etc., you can use Logos. You can pound your way through it and find what you're looking for. And if you really want to go all in, you can just sell your print library and live like some sort of heathen and own only digital resources. But you don't leave them on the desk when you go behind because they're right there. And almost always, these individual resources are cheaper to buy digitally than in print. So if you're going to buy it anyway and you want to get one or the other, and you're not independently wealthy, Logos is always going to be the cheapest option. Accordance, I've seen it. I've seen others use it. I'm sure it's probably equally valuable in that same area. The lesser ones, I want to make a little quick note about the lesser digital resources. If it's free, there's probably a reason. By the way, you can also banish Strongs and Vines from Logos if you would like, if you feel that's a choice, and you won't see those results anymore, and it's a great day.
Okay, well, yeah, it is nice because I guess, Dr. McClister, you take your whole library with you now to Italy, and that is something I currently cannot do. I'm old-fashioned and have not really used any of these, and so, Jeff, I like your answer when you said that with ebooks, you cannot have the serendipitous discoveries you get with codexes. So I want to tell you something I did real quick before, and you can answer, I guess. I did go on Atla and printed off an article here that argues that the Christians were early adopters of the codex, the very word you used. And so if we want to be like the early Christians, we should be early adopters of technology. That's what this article is arguing. So
I support that.
just keep that in mind.
I haven't read that, but I support that.
Well, that goes back to what we said about Atla a minute ago. You really got to be careful with it. The one thing about it is, and I think, this is going to really make me sound like a curmudgeon. So it's so be it. I'm almost 50, so that happens. But the thing about ebooks is everyone sitting up here on the panel remembers the time before ebooks and the Logos library and stuff. What I worry about for younger people coming along is that while there is extremely powerful and useful and efficient to be able to search your entire library for a phrase or what you're looking for depending on the project you're working on, what happens then is you begin to use the commentaries, let's just use commentaries as my example here for a second, as in a utilitarian way. And you may never realize, certain scholars are known for certain either deficiencies or excellencies because you never read the introduction, because you're just strip mining, kind of in a very utilitarian way, strip mining everything. And so, again, those of us who remember the time before and kind of came of age in our scholarship, learning, everything from certain tendencies in certain commentary series to certain authors' tendencies. I worry that younger people will not learn it that way. And then the serendipity kicks in where, especially when you're new to, let's say, studying Philippians, and you don't realize all that goes on with the Christ hymn, or whether it even should be a hymn, right? Because that's part of the issue in Philippians chapter 2. You may not realize that's such an issue when you're first coming in because you don't see the table of contents, because you don't see the introduction, because you don't see the author's excursus and whatever. And so it's kind of like the whole idea of, telling young people you don't need to learn facts rotely anymore because they can just Google it. You can't Google what you don't know. That is a very good point.
So,
yeah. Anyways, that's my curmudgeon's rant.
All right. Yeah. Do you want to add to it? Yeah.
I agree wholeheartedly. If you're going to use this stuff just to pull things out of their context because it says what you want it to say, that's a misuse. What I think is great about it, I remember back when I was in grad school, one of my professors told me to go and see what had been written on a certain topic. It took me 3 days going through the stacks in the libraries, piece by piece. You don't have to do that anymore. So if you use it correctly, there's a benefit to it, but you can misuse it.
Yeah. All right, we're talking about misuse. With the time we have left, I want to talk about how word studies can be misused. In this year's lectureship, Vines was barely the most quoted word study book in the lecture book. Just right behind it was BDAG. But I know you guys, we wanted to spend the last few minutes we had to talk about why is Vines so popular and what are the concerns about Vines that people should be aware of. And McClister, I think since you said the most, if you don't mind, I'll let you get it started and the other guys can add in or clarify anything.
All right. I want to say this as kindly as I can, but I really do think we ought to move away from Vine's expository dictionary. I know why it's popular. It's easy to use, and Vines agrees with our theology in a lot of ways. He doesn't believe in the continuation of tongues, and he believes in that baptism is immersion and all of that good stuff. But that is not enough to offset what I think are the serious flaws of that. And so let me just run through a couple. First of all, the dictionary is filled with blatant theological interpretation of words rather than just telling you what a word means. Vines tends to give you a theological concept. And if you can't distinguish between a word and a concept, I think you're kind of in trouble when it comes to studying the Bible. Words can create a concept, but a word by itself is not the same thing. And so Vines tends to blur that in an unhelpful way. Secondly, just from kind of in terms of the accuracy, Vines will very seldomly tell you where he's getting his information from. Whereas if you look at a modern lexicon like the Bauer, Danker, Arndt, and Gingrich, their bibliographies, sources, every time a word is quoted, it'll say it's used in this source, this source, this source, and this one. Vine will rarely tell you where he's getting his information from. And that's just a problem. I want to check on a scholar. I don't want to just read something and say, oh, Vine said this. I want to know why he thinks that what he was reading, and he doesn't often do that. Very often, Vines will simply give you the an English translation of a word as if that suffices for the definition. And so, for example, hikanotes is rendered sufficiency in 2 Corinthians 3. That's his definition of that Greek word. And so, we could use something better than that, I think. And then a couple other things. Vines often quotes etymologies to say, oh, this word is made up of this plus this. But I think everybody learned a long time ago that you can't find out the meaning of a word by looking at its etymology. Pardon? Well, I hope so. I mean, a butterfly is not flying butter, right? So etymology doesn't always help you. Vines seems to imply an awful lot that if you know the etymology, you know the word. And then finally, he doesn't seem to know or care a lot about how a word is used in the Septuagint or how the Hebrew Old Testament is coloring a concept. There's just a lot missing in Vines that I think we could do a lot better than that.
And I would agree with everything David said. I guess for my part, what I would add and extend a little bit is I would just be cautious if, for folks, and this just sounds elitist, and I don't mean it that way, but I just experience working with younger preachers, and whatnot. If you don't have a good hand on the original languages in the first place, it's hard to use any of these tools well, because the truth of the matter is a dictionary or a lexicon is descriptive as much as it is prescriptive, right? That's why there will be another edition of, whether it's Halot, the kind of the standard Hebrew lexicon, or, it was bagged when I first started. Now it's BDAG because, the knowledge keeps evolving and growing. And so just as important to rightly avoiding everything from etymological fallacies to cherry picking the definition, even in a lexicon that fits my need, is being able to read in context these words, and so forth. I think everyone on the panel who's done original language work, we can all name words that we've worked with where, reading in context was as key to discerning the right meaning of the word as looking it up even at BDAG. And I'm thinking especially Paul's notorious for this in my experience. And so, and then I just can't, kind of amen enough. The influence of the Septuagint on New Testament word choice is substantial. My classic example for this, and I'm teaching on this, is agape. Everybody has heard the agape sermon from John 21, phileo versus agape. The Septuagint determines agape as much as anything else in the New Testament, and the Septuagint has moved on from the classical Greek usages there. And so again, if you don't know the languages, you don't realize that if you don't have good linguistic sources. And then the last thing I would add before I move on is I think many are familiar with Carson's exegetical fallacies, which, if you're going to wade in to trying to use original languages and you don't have a background in it, that's a must read to save you from many exegetical sins. But the other book, we've already mentioned Moises Silva, but Silva's book, God, Language, and Scripture, you don't have to read the whole thing. Read his opening introductory exercise, 2 or 3 pages, especially those of you in the ebooks. This is one where I endorse buying the ebook. book to save money and time. Read it this weekend if you are inclined to use Bible study software and do word studies. You must read the beginning of God, Language, and Scripture. Silva will humble all of us, myself included, in how easy it is to abuse original languages.
Silva's also written a book earlier than that called Biblical Words and Their Meaning. It's really, really worth reading. And something you were saying else about words, what was it? I'll think of it in a minute. Lost my train of thought.
Well, I completely agree with both what has been said. But in terms of the first question, why Vines? I mean, I think if you, just for example, if you compare the entry with Vines to BDAG, I took a picture, so hold on. So this is about this word morphe, which I already mentioned from the Christ hymn in Philippians 2. BDAG says form, outward appearance, shape. And then he talks about Philippians 2, 6 and 7. And he says this is in contrast to the expression of divinity in the pre-existence Christ. There are a lot of secondary sources and primary sources that speak to the subject. In other words, if you look that up in BDAG, it's a lot of work to figure out what he's getting at. Whereas if you go to Vine, he says morphe denotes the special or characteristic form of, I can't see that very well, of a person or thing. Feature of a person or thing. And then it says it's used with particular significance in Philippians 2, 6 and 7. And then he does mention a source, Gifford. I don't know what that is, but anyway, he says morphe is therefore properly the nature or essence. And then he says the interpretation of the form of God is sufficient to say it includes the whole nature and essence of deity and is inseparable from them, since they could not have any actual existence without it. And he continues on and on. I mean, that will preach, right? I mean, that is powerful. That's not nearly as dry as something like BDAG or LSJ, the classical dictionary, which is going to have a gloss like this and a ton of other references. But as these guys have already said, this is methodologically unsound. This is just not, you cannot tease out that much meaning in a word, even in a context like Philippians 2, that hymn context. So I could continue on about Vines, but I think enough's been said about that.
I thought of my other comment. Just to give you an example of how difficult it is to produce something that is without contradiction and of good quality, Carson's exegetical fallacies. One of the chapters he talks about being aware of information that's laid out in tables, because you can manipulate a table to actually give a wrong impression. And his first edition had one of his own tables in it that gave a misleading impression of things. So he had to rewrite that chapter in the book and fix that table. It's very, and the point is, it's difficult for any author to be really good all the time. You have to be careful and critical whatever you are looking at.
So I'm not. Are we done with the Greek side of things? Because I don't know Greek.
Yeah, you can end
Wow.
on Hebrew. We'll do that.
Well, now I will say this. I think it's important to classify it this way. If you want to do a word study, start in an English dictionary and make sure you understand the committee-based translation you have in front of you. It's probably better than anything you can come up on your own. Like, it just doesn't matter if you're in Hebrew Bible, Christian Bible. That's just bottom line. And make sure you understand the words. And if you've got one that gives you a reason why they picked a word, like the NET has done a really good job of, do that. You're probably 99% to your finish line at that point. If you can dispense with the phrase Strong's defines, then you've actually succeeded in your goal. I think Vines probably is most popular, as it allows someone to say Vines defines as opposed to Strong's. And they've already given up that fight. But I think that's just probably, and the same thing on the Hebrew side. It's the same thing, except I would probably, at least I feel like Hebrew words are stretchier. They have to cover more ground than a Greek word does very often within the context of the biblical text. And so it's even harder to sort out a meaning. And you have some words that some of the conjunctions and stuff do 78 different things in the same text. And so you've got to pay close attention to it, figure out what's going on. And then once you've done that, you're still basically at the surface of things. Each of those entries in the various lexicons you can find are multiple page entries. And so you're going to spend hours on what we would consider one letter worth of text. So your time spent doing that, if you're not interested and deeply invested, is not going to have the same return that you would get from simply knowing what is going on in the English translation you already have. Like I feel like maybe there are people doing that to look like they know more than they do.
Well, thank you guys. If there's not any other really pressing resources you need to share with us on Philippians and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, then we are done here, and we appreciate you so much taking the time to share with us what you all found in your own efforts and time that you've spent researching these good books. So thank you so much, and thank you guys for attending. So again, make sure you get your sheet on the way out of what was cited in this year's lecture book, and if you want access to Atlas and see Ms. Bitsit, and definitely sign up for that. You have a good rest of the afternoon.